and welcome to this session, the 11th session of the SOGICA conference. This session will be talking about reception. I'm your chair, I'm Sophia. I'm a bachelor student in Maastricht, just so you know who I am. So we'll be talking about reception, and we have 3 lovely presentations lined up for you. Each of them will last about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm going to ask the speakers to please also keep to time. Just for your information, this entire session will be recorded and posted online afterwards, but the part in the end where we answer your questions will not. You can type any questions you have in the question and answer box that is at the bottom of your screen, and at the end of all the speeches, when everything is done, we will be looking at the questions and selecting as many as we can to answer for you. We'll either answer them live or answer them via the typing function in the question and answer section. If you want any more information on the speakers, you can find it on the SOGICA website, but I'll also be introducing them now. Let me start by introducing the first speech, which is by Letizia Decol and Luca Falzea. Letizia is a psychologist who graduated in clinical psychology with a thesis supporting the well-being of the gender variant child starting from the family. She deals with LGBTQI+ migration, first in Spain, where she collaborated with the Catalan Association for LGBTQI+ Immigrants and Refugees, and then in Italy, collaborating with Il Grande Colibri. Her last publication is Health, Well-being, and Social Inclusion of Transgender Immigrants and Asylum Seekers. She will be presenting together with Luca Falzea. Luca Falzea is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Turin with a thesis on masculinity and homosexuality in Islam. His research interests vary from LGBT and gender studies to masculinity studies and welfare system studies. In 2018, he collaborated with the project In Fact Changing Families, Changing Institutions, and carried out a research about social services and their relationship to new types of families in the city of Turin. And their presentation will be called Identità in Transito, Reception and Support for Trans Migrants and Asylum Seekers. You can take over the presentation and share your screen now. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you, and thanks to the SOGICA staff for realizing this online version of the conference. Hello everyone, my name is Letizia Decol. Unfortunately, due to work commitments, I will have to leave the conference before the end of the session. I'm really sorry about that, but my colleague will answer all questions. Today, my colleague Luca and I are going to talk about Identità in Transito, reception and support for migrants and asylum seekers trans. Identità in Transito, that in Italian means identities in transition, is the name of a training project we realized in Turin, in the northwest of Italy, on the occasion of the International Trans Day of Remembrance in November 2019. The training project was addressed to associations and institutions dealing with migration and asylum seekers in the city of Turin. We found 3 main reasons to carry out this project. First of all, as Chavez writes in 2011, services declared themselves unable to respond to the particular needs of the transgender and queer migrants, promoting as a consequence the development of several issues such as the difficulty in taking about one's own health, discrimination, dropout, and depressive syndrome. The second reason is a growing interest from the professionals and institutions of our city. The third reason are data provided by the TMM, Transgender Murder Monitoring, in 2019, which describe a scenario of stigmatization and discrimination against transgender and gender non-conforming people. The TMM is a research project that is part of a larger project by Transgender Europe, whose main objective is to systematically monitor and analyze the murders of transgender and gender diverse people. Here are some of the results of the TMM from 2019. 331 murders of transgender and gender non-conforming people were counting in the world. Brazil was the country with the highest rate for the second year in a row, counting 130 crimes. In Europe, 9 cases were registered. TMM researchers point out that the violence committed is not exclusively related to the gender identity of the victim. In fact, it has been recorded that acts of violence frequently also depend on the fact that the victims belong to minorities, discriminated for racism, sexism, xenophobia, and other discriminations. Speaking of number, TMM data show that the 61% of the total number of the victims are sex workers. In the USA, 90% of the victims are Black or Native American women. In Europe, like in Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, 65% of the transgender people killed are immigrant women. So TMM report gives us information about the conditions in which transgender and gender non-conforming migrant people live in the host country and also in Europe. In conclusion, due to the 3 reasons above, we felt it was necessary to create a training project to sensitize, inform, and develop knowledge to professionals and institutions about the needs, the characteristics, and the resources of the transgender and gender non-conforming migrants and asylum seekers. So having said that, I give the floor to Luca, who will deepen the phases of the project we have carried out and the results obtained.
Thank you, Letizia. Thank you, everyone who is listening, and thank you, Sojica, for hosting us. I will start by giving you some info about the project and more practical info. And the project was funded by the municipality of Turin, and it was organized by our association, which is Il Grande Colibri, which is an association that works with intersectionality and minorities in general. We were born as a website sharing articles about intersectionality, and now we are starting to do some work as an association in Turin too, like working with migrants and especially Muslim people and LGBT migrants. The project involved around 20 participants from 4 different associations that were working with migrants, and it was carried out in 2 different days. About the theoretical background that brought us to start this project, we started by a literature about transgender identities. I have to remind you that this project was about educating association and members of association working with migrants. So we were like giving them infos and about transgender identities first, migration studies, and intersectionality. And of course, since I came from a social work background, I also gave them some information about how to work with diversity and the paradigm that social workers developed to work with diversity populations. About the project, it was divided in 3 different moments. The first one was a reception and the presentation of the association and the project itself. And we asked our participants to to talk about themselves, to introduce their association, and especially to talk about their own associations. And we did some ice-breaking exercise, which of course had the aim to break the ice, but also were very useful because they helped us to understand what our participant was expecting from the workshop, their experiences and the instruments they have already used to work with migrant transgender population, and the obstacles they felt they will face or had faced when working with such population, LGBT migrants, but specifically transgender migrants. And a little spoiler, most of them said that they had no experience, no instruments, and their expectations were kind of high for our workshop, which was challenging and interesting at the same time. Then we proceeded to give them the theoretical reasons for our project. We talked about, as I said before, transgender identity, gender identity, and intersectionality. And the main event, which was after a quick break was the discussion of a case study with all the participants. So we printed a story that we made up about a transgender woman who was also a migrant and who wanted to participate in a support group for migrant women, but was rejected from cis women in the group. We presented this case to our participants and we let them discuss this case with us. At first, we thought about doing a focus group, but then we decided to do something more informal, something that would simply let us discuss with them too, instead of just moderating the focus group. And this brings us to the results of this workshop. Our participants were part of an association who already worked with migrants, and so they have a richness in experiences and instruments to work with people coming from different countries. But all of them, or better, mostly of them, remarked their lack of knowledge in the particular case of LGBTQIA+ migration, and specifically transgender migrants. They pointed out how they didn't have any education on the matter, they didn't have any information on the matter, they couldn't point out, they didn't know which bureaus or associations work with this particular population of migrants. And this was very clear from the case study. So they had both difficulties from a theoretical point of view and also from a practical point of view. They, for example, when we discussed this case study I mentioned earlier, some of them understood the difficulties of the cis women and therefore proposed like a compromise, like some encounters of the group would be carried out with just biological women, and some other with the presence of transsexual women, transgender women. And some other pointed out how they wouldn't know where to start to deal with such situations. We think that this project has a value for research and organization purposes because it highlights how in the city of Turin, the association working with migrants have no clues on how to work with transgender migrants, and this was their own words. They also told us how difficult it was for them to find dormitory for people, for homeless people and homeless migrants that weren't sex-based. And so our project was useful to uncover all those problems that associations working in these fields face. And also another interesting thing is that we managed to make them sit together, talk for an afternoon about this topic, and this could lead to the creation of a network, which was something that all of them felt like was missing. They told us, we don't know who we should call when we have some issues with working with migrants, with transgender migrants. We don't know if there are associations who work specifically with them, if there are support groups for them. And so aim of this project was also to make them talk between each other and have a moment to know each other and maybe start doing something together. We thank you for your attention, and we are here for your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Luca and Letizia, for your super valuable contribution. I think it's also a really cool practical approach that has a lot of practical relevance, so thank you for sharing it with us. Our next presentation will be by Raffaella Pasqual. She is a fellow researcher of the Project Provide of the University of Palermo in Italy. She has written articles on the subject of migration, violence, and human trafficking with Springer, Peter Lang, and Franco Agnelli. She will soon publish her monograph, Motherhood in the Context of Human Trafficking and Sexual Exploitation, a case study on Nigerian and Romanian women in Italy with Springer. And today her presentation will be about LGBTI migrants stranded in the Italian reception system. Raffaella, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I will try also to share my PowerPoint. Yeah, I forgot to mention that I am also an operator and cultural mediator at the Help Desk La Migración of the Association of Archigay Palermo. So yeah, my presentation is regarding especially the subject of LGBTI plus migrants in the Italian reception system. I have to say that I live in Sicily. So as you might imagine, in the last years, especially after the Arabic Spring in 2011, but mostly after 2013, Sicily has received major migration flows that actually have challenged the reception system, the Italian reception system. Furthermore, as you might know, if we think about being under the Dublin regulation, all the migrants that have arrived, they were obliged to present their asylum claim in Italy. Therefore, somehow the Italian government had to set up an emergency reception system for them. And if you can imagine, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, that's because the camera is on the side. In 2016, more than almost 2,000 bats were under the Italian reception system had more or less 200,000 bats. 73% were actually of temporary reception centers, and only 35,000 beds were on the so-called excellence model, where that actually has an integration approach for the migrants. Well, the other one, as we will see, it's a little bit different. So regarding my research hypothesis, the first of all is the influence of such reception system in the analysis on the vulnerability screening of these migrants, especially if we think that most of them have arrived after a journey of high level of violence, especially SOGI migrants. And furthermore, how it also can influence regarding their integration in the Italian society. As for the methodology, as I said, I work as well as a cultural mediator in the Help Desk La Migración. So I did the participant observation in the period of 2016 to 2019. We are speaking about more or less 15 beneficiaries from mostly African countries, such as Cameroon, Nigeria, Tanzania, Senegal, one from Ghana, and actually one Asian, so Pakistan, and then Mali, Sierra Leone, and Morocco. So the aim of my research was mainly to analyze the situation of LGBT migrants in the Italian reception system, and to understand as well their particular needs regarding once they arrive in Italy. So if we do a theoretical framework, we understand that the majority of the reception system is based, tries to give a response to emergency massive migratory flows. Therefore, this means that they are mostly suitable to receive huge quantities of migrants that will be established in larger, really large structures. Imagine that most of them are hotels, some naval, some military bases, and very isolated from urban centers. So you also can understand how it can influence the integration of these migrants where they are actually far away from the urban areas. Regarding the Italian reception system, once we have started to receive the migration flows, there was a lack of legislation on the issue. So the first reception systems, they were legislated through ordinances, decrees, and circulars. So they were formed into a very short period. There were no control, they were not being monitored, and this had led to the situation that most of the lack of control and monitoring of these reception systems, they have, how can I say it? They somehow influenced that there was an opaque business behind and a very clientelist model than regarding on centers that would prefer to have operators with professional skills on the issues, especially regarding to vulnerability issues of the migrants. So the reception system was mainly entrusted to private entities. Imagine that many of them, as I said, they were tourism managers. So we are speaking about ex-hotels, people that have never worked before on the third sector. They have never worked before with vulnerable people. So I'm sorry, and I don't know how to go back, and this has led that there was a lack of attention to the vulnerability of the migrants that have arrived. So only with the legislation decree, of 142/2015, this type, so CAS in Italian, so temporary reception centers, were established by law, but they were mainly, I'm sorry, because there's some kind of construction nearby my house, but I hope you can hear me. So they were mainly focused on providing first needs to the migrants. We are speaking about mostly food and accommodation, lacking all as well from the integration services such as Italian language or even legal support, psychological support, and work integration. So these migrants, they arrived, they were parked in the centers for a long time, and they had no access to this other typology of services. And mostly, and it's very important to say that despite that it was obligatory to do a health check and vulnerability check once they arrived, they didn't do it because there was the interest of the managers of the centers in order to have lots of migrants, because they received the 35 euros per diem per migrant, but there was a discrepancy between the proportion of migrants and operators working with them. So therefore there were a lot of migrants and a very small number of operators that could focus on the needs of these migrants. So as I also said, the problem was that these people, most of them, they had the background of violence, especially, and I have to say, as an operator, we have understood that SOGI migrants are particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse during the journey. In fact, we had one case that after a year in Nakara, only when he came to the association, and we could conduct the person to a doctor. He did an HIV test, and then he resulted positive. So it's also very complicated, because once you put the migrants in this kind of centers and there's no health check, even if they were sexually abused during the journey, then this could have consequence in a long time. Furthermore, one thing that we also encountered as help desk was what we call the paradox of the SOGI migrants, because they were fleeing from highly homophobic countries. They were fleeing because of that, and once they arrived, they were placed inside the reception structure with compatriots that actually they shared the same homophobic feelings. So there were a lot of problems of violence and risk for SOGI migrants within these reception centers that especially were without control, because, as I said, there was a lack of operators that could accompany these migrants. So, for instance, I decided to bring you the case of Am. He was speaking with his roommates, and the roommates started to speak about girls, if he liked girls, and here it's a bit interesting, because since I was in Italy and I was free, I could say that I was gay. So for the first time, he said he was gay, but he did not realize that saying that he's gay, it was different for what we thought. He thought that he would be safe. And after this, he had started some problems. He was assaulted because he declared to be gay within the reception center. And even here, the professionals working in the center, they didn't know how to deal with the situation, so they have isolated him, which is actually worse. That's when he contacted us, and we tried to move him to another center where no one knew that he was an homosexual, because it could be danger for him. And the fact that he continued to live in the same room with other 5 men, but without speaking about his life, so in somehow a bit as it was in his origin country. I also would like to bring the case of B. She was a transgender M2F, and she was placed according to her name in a male reception center. So you could imagine the situation of a transgender woman in a center that was for males. So she had a lot of problems. They did not assaulted her as in the case before, but still she was not in, as you might imagine, she was verbally harassed, and it was very complicated to her as well. But this is regarding to SOGI migrants. But if you think about, and as I said, there are some problems of the reception center that is transversal to all the migrants that have arrived. For instance, the social spatial segregation of migrants. There were cases in which the migrants had to walk 8 kilometers in order to get only to the bus, because these were very isolated areas, or even in one case 20 kilometers to reach the bus stop. And this is not only the physical distance, but also the emotional distance and the integration distance, because even to come to us, that we supported psychologically, legally, and even with the asylum claim, it was always a problem to come to our center and to find that, because, for instance, in the case of this asylum seeker that had to work 8 kilometers only to get to the bus, there was only one bus to Palermo, so he had to get that bus. So this isolation was a huge obstacle even to our services. And of course, you can also imagine that it also influences regarding the job opportunities, not only because they are far away from the urban areas, but also because there are a lot of people from the same country that can speak the same language, so they have no interaction with the autochthonous people, and so they don't learn Italian because they never speak Italian, and they even don't know how things work in Italy in this way. And of course, if you think about it, this also is enhanced due to their intersectionality, to the fact that they are migrants and as well from the LGBTIQ community. And another thing that I think it's very important to say, and what we realized, is that, for instance, if you are in a urban area, there's less discrimination regarding migrants and LGBT people. So also the fact that these migrants were put in such small rural areas was also a problem to them, because they had a little contact with the LGBT community in Italy. But so this has led me to the question, if all the SOGI migrants, they are vulnerable. And in this case, we know that the social context and family is a resistance factor to vulnerability of the individual. But then I thought about one of our beneficiaries, and I think this case is very important to tell because it's very particular. So this person has arrived to Italy directly by plane. So already he didn't pass through all the violence that the others had encountered during the journey. And as well, he was being hosted because he came to his boyfriend, his Italian boyfriend. So he was inserted directly in a house, in an Italian family, and we could see the difference between him and the others. He did not have the exposure to violence and risk. He had emotional ties with local people. He was highly accepted, and even especially the integration due to the social cultural level and linguistic level, because after a year, he could speak perfect Italian. So if all SOGI migrants are vulnerable, maybe no, but if the system makes them vulnerable, yes, of course. If I have to compare, the reception Italian system renders the it's transversally, how can I say, all migrants can be vulnerable in that type of reception center. But if we think of people that actually were able to come directly by plane and had the opportunity to be integrated in the community, that was a really different thing. And I'm finishing. What I would like to highlight is in this case is that we understood that in a absence of emotional ties and community of belonging, for instance, imagine that diaspora normally is an advantage to migrants, but if you are from the LGBT community, actually can become your enemy. So a specific association for LGBT migrants is a factor of resilience, and it totally enhances self-esteem and the establishment of family ties, emotional ties, and therefore, I mean, in this case, also more integration with the local community. So thank you so much, and I'll wait for the questions. Thank you. And I'm sorry for the noise on the background.
Thank you so much, Raffaella, for your valuable contribution and for giving us such a great overview of the problems that SOGI migrants can face in the Italian reception system. I suggest we move on to our last presentation, which will be done. Wait, I have to quickly open my documents, by Dr. Petra Sussner. Dr. Petra Sussner is a postdoc researcher at HU Berlin. She finished her PhD on reception conditions, refugee status, and the LGBTQI Spectrum, to be published in 2020. Beyond that, she spent research visits at the Amsterdam Center for Migration and Refugee Law and used to practice as a lawyer in Vienna. And the title of her research is If You Leave, the Blame's on You, a human rights-based perspective on LGBTQI asylum seekers' entitlements to protection from violence in accommodation centers.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia, for the introduction. Also, thank you to the Sojika team for making all of this happen, and thank you to Camilo for facilitating this session. First, I'm sharing my screen with you now. Here we go. No, yeah. So, my title is If You Leave, the Blame's on You. And with this title, I refer to the practical problem that, and we've heard about that now, that a vast majority of LGBTIQ asylum seekers are living with discrimination, with violence and threats on a day-to-day basis, and not only at Europe's borders, but right here in the middle of Europe as well. Okay. This problem is well known. Lots of refugees, NGOs, artists, activists have talked about it and have reported about it. And in recent years, a certain term, and we've heard about that now, has become kind of a buzzword. It's vulnerability. And the question is, here we go. We have two major problems with the term of vulnerability. The first problem is, from a legal perspective, we have no real clarity whether LGBTIQ claimants are legally vulnerable. Both the European Court of Human Rights as well as the European Union legislator, they use the term vulnerability to establish protection against violence. The court has established a lot of, has ruled on a lot of cases, and basically it has ruled that asylum seekers as such are vulnerable, that LGBTIQ people are vulnerable, and also that LGBTIQ asylum seekers are vulnerable. But we don't have any rulings yet about accommodation centers and protection against violence. On the other hand, we have European Union legislation, of course, the Reception Conditions Directive, and it has rules for special protection for vulnerable people in reception centers. But the problem that we face here is the directive is defining vulnerable people in Article 21 by listing them. The list is not exhaustive, and it is not explicitly mentioning LGBTIQ people. On the one hand, we have the UNHCR that is actually working on, based on the assumption that LGBTIQ people are vulnerable. EASO does basically the same. On the other hand, the European Parliament has spoken in favor of explicitly listing LGBTIQ people 2 times now, and the European Union legislator has done it yet. So we have no real clarity here. The other problem with the term of vulnerability is a problem that is mainly addressed by social sciences and humanities. Vulnerability carries the danger of re-stigmatizing people. What do I mean? Basically, let me use examples. Intersex people aren't vulnerable because they are not fitting the medical system, but because the medical system is failing them consistently. Trans and non-binary people are not vulnerable because they don't fit into the binary reception system. It's because the system is failing them. And that applies as well for most of the LGBT people, of course. And vulnerability carries the danger to make us forget about that and search for the mistake by asking for identity. I'm coming from legal gender studies and I have a lot of thoughts on that, but today I will focus on a different legal aspect. And the main argument that I want to make is that while talking of this whole debate about whether or not LGBTIQ people are vulnerable, makes us forget a very simple, basic, but important fact. Protection against violence is not a favor, it's a right. It's an individual right and an obligation to states. And I want to talk about this right now, and I want to talk about how to exercise it from an individual perspective. So let me start with the basic human rights perspective. Violence against LGBT seekers can come from police, of course, from other officers, but it mainly, as the reports say, it comes from other private persons, other inhabitants in reception centers. So the state is basically addressed as an authority of protection, or is asked to protect people. And the European Court of Human Rights has actually established basic obligations, state obligations to protect people, basically under the prohibition of torture or the right to live. And we have a lot of case law here. And basically it says that there is a real risk of a real and immediate threat or violence, and the state knows or should know there's a duty to act. And this duty to act basically includes preventive measures, it includes intervention, it includes supervision and support, security systems, and of course it includes prosecuting incidents of violence. Yeah, of course, this whole system is supported by the Georgia Carter Principle number 23 since 2017. It explicitly mentions violence in anti-LGBTIQ violence in reception centers and states' obligation to protect people. The dangers and the obligations are assessed by the European Court of Human Rights based on an individual system. And I want to quote a decision, it's actually from 2003, so it's older, but I think it's quite helpful to understand how the court is linking the individual case and vulnerability and states' obligations in this area. This case was about sexual abuse of a child, and the court said that states are required to take measures designed to ensure that individuals within their jurisdiction are not subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment, including such ill treatment administered and so forth. These measures, and this is important, should provide effective protection, in particular of children and other vulnerable persons, and include reasonable steps to prevent ill treatment of which the authorities had or ought to have had knowledge. So basically, states are obliged to especially protect children, other vulnerable people. And we have case law on, I mentioned that, on the vulnerability of asylum seekers and LGBTIQ people. Obviously, of course, we have MSS versus Belgium and Greece. In 2011, the court has ruled that asylum seekers as such are vulnerable because usually they don't have access to the labor market, to a regular social benefit system, so they cannot help themselves in a way that maybe citizens can. And basically the states created this situation, vulnerability, and so they are responsible to give special protection. That's the idea of MSS. We also have this idea, and I think there's a striking similarity here. We have, the court works on a similar assumption when it comes to state custody. In Stasi versus France in 2011, the court ruled, it was a case of a gay man who was a prisoner. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the state is obliged to offer safe space, to offer supervision, to offer security, and to prosecute any incidents of violence. And I think that basically the same must apply for reception centers. And this is supported by the decision OM v. Hungary in 2016. This was about a detention center, and the court ruled that LGBT, and I guess the I is supposed to be included, that LGBTIQ asylum seekers in detention centers are especially vulnerable because they are likely to re-experience violence that made them flee at the first place, and states have to protect them. So to sum up on a human rights level, I think that, that states are actually already aware about the dangers that LGBTIQ I don't know if this was working now. I go on, you will tell me if I'm the only one seeing my screen. So yeah, I was talking about what I think on a human rights level. Well, I think that NGOs, refugees, and so forth have talked enough about the dangers that LGBTIQ refugees and asylum seekers are facing. And so I basically think that states are aware of these dangers and are already obliged to offer preventive measures. When it comes to the individual case, it's a little more complicated, especially when people are living in the closet. But for now, let me just say also that just because an asylum seeker is living in the closet, states' obligations are not obsolete. And we can talk about the other aspects in the discussion if you're interested in that. For now, I want to have a look at the reception directive and the system of protection that we have here, and how it is supposed to be read through from a human rights based perspective. Basically, in the Reception Conditions Directive, we have a protective system that includes two steps. There's the general clause of Article 7 of, that says that member states must ensure that accommodation provides an adequate standard of living for applicants, which guarantees their subsistence and protects their physical and mental health. And we have already heard how damaging the threat of violence is for mental health and of course for physical health. So include safe housing, as far as I'm concerned. The second step is Article 18. And Article 18 is basically working with vulnerability. And it says, in accommodation centers and premises, member states must take into consideration gender-specific concerns and the situation of vulnerable people, among other things. They must undertake appropriate measures to prevent assault and gender-based violence, including sexual assault and harassment. So, based on that, member states actually have three options to fulfill their human rights obligations to protect LGBTIQ people. First, they can say, well, we don't acknowledge LGBTIQ people as vulnerable people. Then they have to fulfill their protections to their obligations to protect through Article 17, the general clause. There is a disadvantage for states here because under Article 17, they must deliver at once. They do not, the directive offers some time frame for assessing special needs of vulnerable people, but if states don't consider LGBTIQ people to be vulnerable, this time frame is gone. So maybe it's even advisable for states to categorize LGBTIQ people as vulnerable. That's the second possibility. They can say, okay, we consider them vulnerable, and therefore we use Article 18 to fulfill our human rights obligations. And the third option, maybe you have already asked yourself, how about gender? The third option is that they use the gender-specific concerns to fulfill their obligations. Basically, this is possible. And for example, the UNHCR is using such an approach in the guidelines number 1, where the UNHCR says that sexual orientation is an aspect of gender. But we have European Union law here. And the problem is that, of course, we have the decision Lisa Grant from the European Court of Justice that actually says that under European Union law or discrimination law, sexual orientation is not an aspect of gender. On the other hand, we of course have PVS in the European Union law that says that gender cannot be reduced to cisgender within European Union law, discrimination law, and I think the same applies here. So let me be very clear about that. I actually think that inter and trans people are already covered by gender-specific concerns in Article 18. And if states want to use Article 18 to protect LGBT people as well, they have to categorize them as vulnerable. So, and now let me conclude, But basically my main argument was that a human rights-based perspective doesn't really care about these details. States are obliged to protect people, to offer safe accommodation, to offer security measures, support mechanisms, and the prosecution of anti-LGBTIQ violence. And of course, it's of and not from. If states have to qualify people as vulnerable for that, so fine, be it. And now I want to close with the question, what to do now? What to do in individual cases? And I know that access to justice in individual cases when it comes to reception is highly difficult. And usually NGOs and peer organizations find individual solutions for people. Here in Berlin, also in Vienna it's Queerbase or Diakonie, they do a lot and find a lot of individual solutions. Still, as a lawyer, I think we need case law. We need reliable standards for all those people, at least, who do not manage to get in touch with peer organizations. And now many of you probably know that the Reception Conditions Directive actually does not provide for a decision, or usually there's no formal decision about reception benefits. But there's Article 26 of the Reception Conditions Directive that says member states must provide for a right to appeal against decisions to grant, withdraw, or restrict benefits from the Reception Conditions Directive. And I would argue that here in that case, when it comes to LGBTIQ asylum seekers, member states are systematically restricting benefits, namely safe housing, that is securing their physical and mental health. So my point would be, apply for decisions, apply for lawful accommodation, and appeal if it's not granted. And we do have case law here. We have the ruling of the European Court of Justice in Zimad and Gisti, of course, from 2012, where the court ruled that the period during which the material reception conditions, that is to say, here, safe housing, must be granted to the applicants is to begin when the asylum seeker applies for asylum. And what is the consequence if that doesn't work out? There we have the decision Sakiri. It was a decision on the Belgium system. The Belgian housing capacities were exhausted. And European Court of Justice said, well, fine, that actually, but you still have the option to grant financial allowances instead. And actually you have to, under the Reception Conditions Directive, and the court ruled, if member states are not in a position to grant the material reception conditions in kind, the directive leaves them the possibility of opting to grant financial allowances, enabling them to obtain housing, and if necessary, on the private rental market. So my point would be, apply for safe housing and in event to apply for financial allowances so that people can access safe housings themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sissener, for your interesting and detailed, thorough presentation, and also for providing some paths towards solutions.